Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm so excited to be talking to the wonderful Marianne Jean-Baptiste all about hard truths. And one of the first things that I wanted to talk about was, in working with Mike Lee, he has this amazing process where there's so much in preparation. And I know that the beginning of that is the two of you having a one-on-one conversation where you start discussing people that you've met, people that you've encountered, and really narrowing down the idea of who a character might be. And I was interested in kind of how you started to perceive who this character might be just from seeing the people that he was honing in on and realizing that he was really fascinated by people that you were discussing who were maybe a little bit trickier as humans and, maybe a little bit more antagonistic in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it was funny because we were partway through that process, which could take a few days because I think I had over 100 names on the list. And I was sat there just, I described somebody and he was like, yeah, well, she won't do. And I thought, oh, she's too nice. Okay, he's going for something a little bit more abrasive, you know. Um, but then, I mean, once we pass that stage and we start to create somebody, it's the sort of disappointment that he starts putting in and the failures and the heartbreaks and stuff and the fears, um, and then all of a sudden you're left with what is pansy, really.
And I think there's something so interesting in terms of the way that you make choices for the character as well, which is, if it's something that she would have autonomy over in her life, then that's a decision
Mm.
that you as the actor get to make. But, if it's something like, oh, did she pass or fail her exams at school? That's out of her control. So Mike would make those decisions. And since you first worked with him, has that always been the delineation of how to make specific decisions about characters?
Yeah, the God choices, I called them. He's always made those choices. I've had the pleasure of him killing off two of my characters' mothers. Um, yeah, but it's actually it is such an important element in that that's what forms the character because you are a sum of those sorts of experiences in your life, and I think that that's what makes the characters that he creates with his actors really rich. As if I had my way, obviously she would have had lots of great relationships in her life and, had a fantastic job and all that.
I also love that I've heard you talk extensively about that feeling that Pansy is someone that, you know in the world and a lot of people know people with, if not the whole picture of a pansy, at least elements of it. And it feels like there's kind of this real timeliness, particularly to some of the shifts in society and some of like the intolerance that exists in certain spaces. And I was interested in how you shaped her very specifically, but also in a way that does feel very broad and so connected in the way that it does.
Yeah, I think my way into her was observation and just going out. Obviously, I didn't get to study a profession like you normally would. You'd normally go off and research a job for how many months. So my sort of field trips were out in the grocery store or any other, just public spaces and just observing, making observations and then deciding her attitude and how she viewed the world. And I think that's what, because obviously they're my observations, but then you kind of have to warp them to fit with the way Pansy would see things. A couple is frolicking on a sofa. It's in a sofa store. Yeah, look at them. You can't. The most of us would say, "Oh, get a room," but Pansy looks at it thinking germs. They're sitting on there with their sweaty bottoms. Somebody's going to buy that. So, do you know what I mean? So it was like it kind of just grew from just quite innocent observations, turning into these awful sort of thoughts of hers.
It's so interesting with what you're describing as well, because she says so many things out loud that most people might think or experience as an internal monologue, but they have that filter to not express it. And I was curious if you kind of thought about a lot of the dialogue as you were shaping that through the improv stage in preparation as like, just a very outward internal monologue for her.
Oh yeah, it was he was very clear about talking nonstop. Just talk. Whatever comes into her head, just let it out. And so it was that like stream of consciousness type thing, you know, with her, and no filter whatsoever,
I
and not
also
taking a breath for anyone for anyone else. I mean, it's really tiring. It was really tiring just thinking, oh my God, can somebody please just say something? It's like, yeah.
it's so impressive as well because I feel like you find the rhythm of not only her dialogue, but the way that it kind of crosses over with other people. You know, she's not constantly talking as someone else is talking. There are kind of these breaths and these pauses. And I was interested in, you know, working with the rest of the cast and just finding the rhythm of it for her individually, but also in sync with them as well.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is though, the two people that she interacts with quite a lot, the husband and her son, don't say anything, you know, so it's just her. And I think that her frustration comes from that as well, because somewhere she wants somebody to answer back. She wants a conversation, but she doesn't actually leave room for one. And if somebody else says something, she'd shut them down. So, I mean, it's a no-win situation. We, with all of the scenes, we improvise them and we repeat them until we've memorized them. And, you know, Mike will come in and orchestrate. You come in there, you say that there, you do, you know, and that's beautifully done. So that by the time we get to shooting, everybody knows exactly what they're doing, you know. And sometimes it's quite musical. I mean, like in the grocery store with the other women interjecting and going back and forth. I mean, it was, yeah.
It's also such a great point that you just brought up that she does want someone to kind of give it back to her. And was that the reason behind creating that choice of the interaction in the parking lot with the other driver? It feels like that because it feels like there's almost a spark to her of like, oh, he's actually giving back as good as I'm giving him in this moment, and there's this weird joy in it.
Yeah, I mean, Mike, obviously, because you don't meet anybody else that you know that you're not supposed to know. So at that point, it was just the meeting of these two people. You don't know what sort of person it's going to be. You just know that you're going to go into the car park and something's going to happen, and you go, oh, okay, let's go with that. But after we finished the improvisation, Mike came up and said, okay, how was that? And I said, she wants to marry him. It was like she just felt alive. She came alive because someone was fighting back.
It's such a great scene. And you know, with what you were describing as well, you know, you also don't know the information of the scenes outside of your scenes. So did you even know, or was it not until you saw the film for the first time that you even understood, oh, she's the main character and she's like the centralizing character to bring all the rest of them together?
Yeah, I mean, I had an idea because, you know, I'd been flown over from LA for 5 months in a nice little apartment in London. So I knew that it wasn't going to be minor. I didn't know that it wasn't more sort of an ensemble or more of a piece about two sisters equally sort of spread out. But yeah, so the first time I saw it, it was like, wow, that's where Moses goes on his walks. That's what he's doing. You know, I mean, it's wonderful. You really get to discover the film. Um, I think the first time I saw it, I just didn't know what to make of it. It was quite shocking, you know. The second time was rather sort of, it's kind of triggered me. I was a bit anxious watching it because of her anxiety. That sort of came back. And then the third time was quite emotional. I really felt for her. But also it was with an audience in Toronto, and it was the first time with a public audience, and people were laughing, and I was like, they're laughing. I couldn't believe it.
Because obviously you're not playing it for any sort of humor. You know, you're
No,
playing everything as the straight emotion of how Pansy feels, which is quite serious, I imagine.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've got a sense of humor and would think, oh my God, she didn't say that, did she? And what the, you know, but actually listening to it with an audience and seeing it, you just go, okay. But I mean, you laugh for different reasons, don't you? I mean, I think some of the laughter is about recognition. Some of it's just like nerves, because in any situation like that, one gets a bit nervous. Um, so yeah, it's the film that just I keep discovering things about it when I watch it, because it's not a script that I'd studied or anything like that. Um, so I just keep seeing things even things that I was part of. I just keep seeing things thinking, oh my God, look at that. Oh yeah, and that makes, oh yeah.
No, as an audience member, it's the same each time I've seen this film now. There's new little kind of pieces that you unearth from it. Um, you were bringing up the point of, I don't know where Moses goes on the walk as me, but also Pansy doesn't know either.
Yeah.
And I was interested, does that kind of create almost like a gift of focus in the fact that you don't have to fill your head with any information that isn't relevant to what you're doing on screen? It really is, what are the things directly in her world?
Yeah, absolutely. But it's also about reality. It's like, we don't know. You know, my husband's going to work. I've not gone with him. He might have gone somewhere else for all I know. Do you know what I mean? It's about making things as real as possible and not trying to preempt anything. You know, not trying to sort of like, okay, I'm going to react like that when he comes back in because da 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 da. So you can't do any of that. It just has to be in the moment. It has to be very organic.
And in working with Michelle Austen and building that collaborative history together, I wanted to ask about the experience of building up who their mother was as a character, because, she was someone that you fully fleshed out with the two of you and with Mike, and then he killed her off as he does sometimes with your mothers, as you were saying, but how that really helped to make everything feel real. And we're both sharing the same exact details of who she was and the factual information.
Yeah, I mean, working with Michelle is a delight anyway. But I mean, we relished like picking out the clothes that Pearl wore, describing what, Isatis, she used to wear that perfume when we were growing up. We knew where she worked. We every detail. So when he murdered her, um, I mean, we went out for a drink after rehearsals because we were kind of mortified about it. But the interesting thing was that both of them reacted quite differently surrounding the death, obviously because they had different ideas about how they grew up and who was preferred and who wasn't. But Pansy doesn't open up to her about her experience of finding the mother, and resents it and is angry about it and has held a grudge ever since then. And of course, Michelle or Chantal knows nothing about that
Yeah,
until she finds out about it, obviously. Yeah.
and even to the point that you were just saying, they had very different perspectives of their mother, and they lived in the same house, but their experience of who their mother was to them was very different. And there's things that come up in that conversation between the two of them at the graveside of, you know, Pansy had to shoulder a lot of things, and there were probably a lot of responsibilities. And I was interested in your perspective as to how that was such a different experience for her than for her sister.
Well, I think being the oldest child, she had to look after her sister. There were certain things she couldn't do after school because her sister finished at a different time and she'd have to bring her home or to the grandparents' house. And I think a lot of resentment grew up through that. I think resentment also grows up. I mean, having two kids, the youngest one kind of, gets away with a bit more because you've been very strict with the older one, and some things have worked, some things haven't. So, the oldest one is kind of the experiment, really. And the younger one kind of gets to be a bit freer. And I think that's quite natural. But given Pansy's personality and life state, she would always kind of think that somebody got a better deal than she did. Do you know what I mean? That's all coupled with a lot of other things. Her perception of how much her mother loved her or did not love her.
Yeah, and there's a huge amount of hurt and pain in who she is because of that experience and how she's always felt. And I was interested if that shaped a lot of how she moves in the world, whereas it's this idea of I'm going to attack you first before you attack me, and it almost feels protective. And did you feel like a lot of the reason that she does that does stem back to that relationship with her mother?
No, I mean, it's
Hmm.
part of it, but I
Yeah.
mean, there's another element that she doesn't like going outside. She's afraid of going outside. And although you see her outside engaging, it's something that she's had to do. Nobody's, flagged up early on in her life that, this person really doesn't like being outside and is afraid and has anxiety and has all these things. She's just been told to get on with it. So when you're told to get on with it, you find a way to compensate or overcompensate with, I mean, the list of fears and dislikes that Pansy had is like it's countless. So it's I wouldn't say it's one thing necessarily. It's a lot of things.
No, I appreciate that. I think that's really interesting. And, within that, like you were bringing up, it's like when she receives the flowers at the end, that's something that she's quite fearful of. And so there's so much in terms of her just removing them from the wrapping and placing them so delicately in the vase. And how did the idea of just thinking about the anxiety of doing this shape that scene for you?
Well, there were as I said, there were a number of things that she was afraid of. I had a whole list that I had to sort of present to Mike of things that she didn't like. And she would often say that she didn't like something rather than I'm afraid of it or it creeps me out or whatever, because that would be a sign of weakness. But it was, he did what he always does, was say, well, she's got these, but well, what would she do? And, I said she'd probably find a way to put them in that vase. And so it was like, well, take as long as you need, warm up, get into character, take as long as you need and get them in there. So it's just literally doing it and living each moment thinking nothing is going to escape from these petals or these leaves. It's absolutely fine, and just the idea that she was doing it for her son and not for herself, I think is what got her through doing it.
Yeah, and I think, to the point that you were making as well just now in terms of how to her it's, oh, I don't like this thing, but rather than saying I'm afraid, it's the same with the way that she expresses a physical pain rather than saying it's coming from an emotional pain inside of me.
Yeah.
And how did you set about figuring out how the physical side of this emotional pain was going to manifest in her?
Well, gosh, I don't even know if it was so much of a decision. It kind of happened. I mean, I was reading about a cluster of mental illnesses, and quite a few of the things that Hansy was dealing with were on those lists. So it was just like finding, and hypochondria and what that could be, a product, a byproduct of, etc., etc. So she would have headaches. She didn't sleep very well, so she had insomnia, which resulted in headaches. Sometimes they were real, sometimes they weren't. She had gosh, upset stomach, yeah, I mean, it's a lot of it. I mean, when you're working in this way, it's like you're not necessarily thinking and marking each thing. This stuff sort of happens. I mean, when she goes to the doctor, she gets really frustrated. Even when she describes all these symptoms, when she's really angry, she says, "It's me head." And I think that is a clue into what is happening with her, because she feels this pain, but she just doesn't realize that it's emotional pain and not physical pain. It's stress, which can cause any number of things, but who knows?
Right, and there's a real universality in terms of not necessarily having the vocabulary or knowing specifically the root of things in at certain points for everybody. And you were just talking about some of the research that you were doing into kind of like, okay, well, if she had hypochondria or she had, this specific thing, was it helpful to get didactic and try to kind of like diagnose more specifically, or was it more helpful to keep it a little bit broad and distant because she's a little bit more broad and distant and isn't in that
Exactly.
space? Yeah.
Yeah. You have to keep it broad and distant because she was never diagnosed with anything. She would never admit to having anything because for her it was like, I don't have anything wrong with me. It's everyone else. So you park it somewhere. You're aware of it, but you park it.
Yeah. And when you're shooting with Mike as well, it sounds like there's a couple of things that he does in the filming process that are a little bit different. And one of them that I heard him mention was that he'll call warm up before
Mm.
action, and it's kind of this moment for you and for the rest of the actors to just be able to step into the scene. And I was very interested in what that looks like on your side, how that really helps you, and kind of if it fluctuates with him just observing and kind of finding that moment where he senses, okay, now we're ready.
Mm. I think it's extremely helpful because, especially when you're playing a character like this, the most important bit is coming out of character because he does the same, he'll say cut and he'll say, right, come out of character. And you just need those few moments to just, breathe as you would breathe and just come back from whatever it is that you're doing. But equally, you've been having a laugh and a cup of tea, maybe vaping or whatever, actors do in the downtime. You just need that moment to sort of like plug back in to her, the physicality. Mine would be I'd be joking with somebody and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, there's nothing funny about anything that's happening with this woman. Let's get into that headspace. Yeah, I mean, I started working with him soon out of drama school. So it was really, I think I was really fortunate to sort of lock into these practices really early so that now it's kind of second nature working in this way, sort of going, okay, into character, bang, out of character, bang, robotic almost. Well,
Would
not quite, not robotic.
Yeah, was that particular flow something that was really helpful, especially for a scene like when they're all back at the house after she's gone with her sister to the graveside, because that's such a heavy scene emotionally, and it's a very different style of performance and space
Mm.
that Pansy's in. And I've heard you say that, you'd be in the other room joking and laughing with everybody, but then you would come back into that real stillness of her.
Yeah, cackling like witches we were. I mean, it was awful. Yeah. Um, I'm trying to the what happens is, and obviously you're in the morning. It's really quite when you come into work and you know that you're going to get into character and etc. I always sort of like left her shoes off because for my thing mentally, I'd go, okay, once the shoes are on, she's in. Do you know what I mean? So everything, the whole body language, everything would sort of like turn into Pansy. When we were doing that particular scene, it was probably one or like I think there were 3 days where it was roasting hot in London. It was one of the hottest days. She had decided that she was going to wear about 4 layers of clothes to the thing. So we were baking. Um, and so, I mean, all of that helped with the discomfort. But there was also she was drained at that point. So it was a matter of just sort of really letting go and getting into that physical state and the mental, that was the grief. That's when she really grieves her mother's death at this point in the piece.
And it's also the one moment where she's completely silent. It's not even the dialogue slows down, it just completely stops in her. And then there's that moment where she's laughing and then breaking into tears, and it makes her sister quite emotional as well. And how was that very different doing a scene in a sequence like that, where it's completely the opposite of any sort of emotion that we've seen in her up to that point, and just the physical stillness and quietness of it?
It was a relief. It was an absolute relief because all of that stuff, right, is in her from the very beginning, but it's like being covered with all this other shit, right? So at that point, if there's one thing to play, and it's just that grief. So it was like, oh, thank God, just let it out, let it out. Yeah. And then just being exhausted, you know. Oh,
And you mentioned that, there's all of those layers of clothing because she hasn't even so much as taken her jacket off since stepping inside. And I love that she has this giant oversized purse and is just sitting there holding it because it's this external manifestation of the fact that she goes into the world carrying her baggage around with her everywhere she goes. And now she's physically holding it.
holding
And
it
I
like
was interested.
somebody's gonna, yeah,
Yeah.
like somebody's
I,
gonna take it from her. It's like it's really interesting because all of that stuff was just organic. There was no sort of like that would be a really beautiful image or that because that's not the way we work. All of it just came from what was happening in the room, in the space. Yeah.
And it's amazing how much autonomy Mike gives his actors in terms of the collaboration, not just in terms of character details, but what is their home going to look like? And I've heard you say, you know exactly what would be in her cupboards and in her drawers. And, what was the genesis of it feeling so important for her space to, have that really tiny couch that doesn't really look like it even fits the whole family, and just making sure that the spaces were exactly how she would want and need it to be.
Because it's all a reflection of her. It's all part of her, and and she has to own it. You know, I've walked onto sets that my characters are supposed to be their home that they've lived in, and you kind of go to open a drawer, and you're running the scene, and you're saying, what can I do in the scene? Or well, she would be doing this or that. And you go to open a drawer, it doesn't open, or you open one and there's nothing in there. So you kind of, I think creating the worlds that we do when you're working like that just gives you the freedom to be and to not break that character, to keep it living and moving. I love the love seat, by the way. That's just tiny because it's just for her.
It's just like all the little details in every corner is so great. And lastly, you were saying how obviously the first time that you worked with Mike, you were just out of drama school, and I know Michelle has also said that working with Mike early on in her career was also really foundational to how she's taken on every role since, and I imagine it's just been so formative. And so when you go into other characters, do you find that you're very consistently using a lot of the tools from the way that you work with Mike throughout every role in your career?
Yeah, absolutely. In a micro form, obviously, because not every job is, conducive to working in that much detail. But I do a lot of homework. For me, it works well. It just roots whatever I'm doing in reality, as opposed to sort of like, okay, some sort of abstract sort of thing that you're kind of trying to grasp. Um, yeah.
It's so wonderful. Well, it's a phenomenal performance in this film. So, congratulations and thank you so much for talking about it. I appreciate it
Oh,
so much.
thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.